Next, we have Barry Coates, who's the founder and CEO of Mindful Money, which is a very useful tool actually for investors, particularly I would say retail investors in New Zealand, to get an idea of what their KiwiSaver and their investment funds are actually invested in. And I've actually been sharing this tool with a lot of people at a lot of talks because I think it's really important. And, you know, collectively, KiwiSaver as a whole can have a large impact, even if you think your one small KiwiSaver account isn't worth much. So, yeah, thank you, Barry. You're going to talk about the role of ESG strategies in New Zealand. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sebastian, and greetings to you all. It's been an interesting day, so I'm aware that you've all listened to a lot of presentations, so we'll try and keep this fairly snappy. Kia ora nami nui kia koutou ko Barry Coates aho ko te kaiarahi o te putea whaiwhakaro. I'm Barry Coates, I'm CEO of Mindful Money. I'm going to share some slides, kind of death by PowerPoint, I'm afraid. But let me just do this. Sebastian, you seeing this okay?
Yes.
Great. So it's worthwhile thinking, why should finance consider sustainability? Because very often what we've been talking about is whether finance should be investing in ways where ESG management or other forms of finance can create a financial advantage, i.e. will it reduce risk and increase returns? I think there's another reason to invest, which is the impact of finance on the outside world. We often sort of tangle these two issues up, whether the outside world has an impact on finance or whether finance has an impact on the outside world. I think we need to make sure that we're not forgetting about the impact of finance on the outside world. So here's my favorite cartoon of all time. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And this is slightly tongue-in-cheek and apocalyptic situation with people sitting in a cave with the drawings of our modern society, which existed previously, sitting on the cave wall. But there's an element of truth here insofar as for a long time and until fairly recently, it was very possible to have a complete conversation about finance without considering anything to do with the impact of finance on the real world. And I would say those conversations still happen pretty regularly today. And I think in future generations, we're going to get people who say, what do you mean you didn't consider the real world impact of finance? Did you imagine that finance had no impact on the real world? And so I think at last we're evolving an understanding of the relationship between capital flows and the world that we live in. And these capital flows help make the world that we live in. One of the ways to look at this, and this is the title of the presentation, so I better talk about ESG, but actually we've been talking about ESG a lot today. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but this is just a useful chart from the US Social Investment Foundation about the different components of ESG. So if you start off on the top right-hand side, corporate governance, you've got your corporate political contributions, executive compensation, board diversity, anti-corruption, board independence. Then you've got the social issues, human rights, avoidance of tobacco, etc., community development, diversity. And then in the green, you've got all of the environmental issues, water use, natural resources use, etc. So these are the ESG factors that, as Florian said, are not always interpreted in the same way, but these are the kind of factors that are incorporated into an ESG analysis. But the key thing about an ESG analysis is not only that you do the analysis, but what do you do with it? And this is what we often find, that lots of funds talk about the way they do ESG analysis as if doing the analysis is the end of the story. And really, it's how you use the ESG analysis in strategies that is most important. And in order to understand this, we've drawn a very simple chart. And actually, this was kind of alluded to earlier on today, but let's just kind of run through it. So on the left, you've got traditional funds that ignore the impact on the environment and society. Then typically what's happened with the early days of ethical investment is the first instinct is to avoid harm. You screen out the sectors or practices that cause social and environmental harm, like fossil fuel companies or tobacco or companies that violate human rights. And that still, for many retail investors, is a predominant strategy that they like, because it's their money, or they regard it as their money, and they don't want it to go into issues that are inconsistent with their values. So there's a strong place for avoiding harm. Then you've got the next strategy, which is to engage with the companies in your portfolio. Exclude the worst companies, engage with the others as an active shareholder to improve their ESG performance. And this engagement is really a mainstay these days of ESG strategies by many funds. They may do some avoidance, but often they talk about engagement as being a main strategy. And we've seen that in successive benchmark reports from the Responsible Investment Association. Then you've got the in a way, sort of where the frontier is going, which is really targeting investments into businesses with higher ESG or sustainability standards, or investments that create a positive impact. And this is where you have a part of a mainstream portfolio that invests in better companies. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you've got investment directly to create a measurable and positive impact while still making a financial return. And this is what we've been referring to during the seminar today as impact investing. So let's just run through these very quickly. Avoiding harm. So this is the annual survey that is done by Mindful Money and Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. And the analysis previously done, thank you, by Helen and Rinzu was doing a deeper dive into the survey data. But just at the top level, this chart shows you what people want to avoid. They want to avoid as the top issue labour rights abuses, human rights violations, environmental degradation. Interestingly, social companies that breach privacy standards is right up there. Companies that don't pay their fair share of tax, etc. And you can look down the list and you see there's weapons and firearms, gambling, tobacco, fossil fuels, adult entertainment and pornography, etc. There are two interesting things about this. Firstly, that these have been quite stable over the 3 years that we've been doing these annual surveys. And we expected to see a lot of churn and a lot of change, but actually on different populations that this survey has been given, actually the results are relatively stable and secure. The second point is, if you look at some of these percentages, I've just highlighted the first three up here, 91% of people agree that human rights abuses is something that they want to avoid in their portfolios. We're not seeing the fact that there's half of the population don't think this is important and half do. Actually, there's a high degree of commonality. So often when we talk to fund managers, they say, oh, well, all ethics are different. Everyone's got their own ethics. But actually what we see from the survey is quite to the contrary. Actually, there are across the New Zealand public a very strong set of shared values about what the New Zealand consumers want to avoid. However, when we look at these issues as represented in portfolios, and Mindful Money puts this data together from every single KiwiSaver portfolio, looking at their direct investments of every fund, plus also their indirect investments through investing in funds and investing in funds that invest in funds. So we are able to give a complete portfolio look-through perspective. And what we find is that although members of the public, for example, want to avoid products tested on animals, there's $2.3 billion of KiwiSaver funds that are invested in that. There's 1.5 billion invested in fossil fuels. There's over $1 billion in human rights and environmental abuse, etc., and some smaller percentages around alcohol, gambling, weapons, etc. Now, the percentages on the inside are those a percent of KiwiSaver as a whole, and these issues that people want to avoid, we've just taken the top 10 issues, account for 7.3% of total KiwiSaver funds. It is significant, and these are often very strongly held views by members of the public. So there are things that people want to avoid in their portfolios. What we've seen in New Zealand is that there is an avoidance of tobacco, which is one of the reasons why tobacco is not strongly in portfolios, and there's avoidance of weapons. However, these other issues are not routinely excluded from most KiwiSaver or retail investment portfolios. There's often a concern about, well, if I do exclude these things, are they likely to adversely affect my performance? And we've talked a lot today about the performance of funds with high ESG values, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think this is a really quite illuminating chart for a couple of reasons. The top line is the S&P 500. The yellow line is the oil and gas index, the US oil and gas index. And the bottom line is the US coal index. As you can see, the US coal index has essentially gone down close to zero. But interestingly, the oil and gas index went up and tracked the S&P 500 reasonably closely until around 2015. So what happened in 2015? Well, that was the time that Mark Carney and others were standing up and saying, we should be aware of the risk of stranded assets, and we should be aware of climate risk. And those who are investing in fossil fuels should understand that there are severe risks in these investments. So what we've seen is sure enough, these risks have been borne out in the value of the shares that are within this index. And we see that I mean, the values have bounced back slightly in the last few months, but still below where they were 10 years ago compared to the S&P, which has risen dramatically by around 14% per annum versus, I think at the moment, this oil and gas index is about minus 3% per annum. So you can see there's a massive drag on earnings if you have significant holdings of fossil fuels. And in a way, we've seen the verification of this with regard to past investments. The New Zealand Super Fund, for example, as Lucas Kangmina said in his presentation, had done a retrospective analysis to look at what would have happened if they hadn't divested from a lot of fossil fuels. And actually, they found that by divesting, they had increased their returns by $800 million. Thank you. We'll, as taxpayers, we're very grateful for them doing that. So that's the issue of exclusions. Many investors want it. It's relatively simple and easy to do these days. And it's often not necessarily a drag on earnings in your portfolio. It may even be beneficial in the case of past experience of fossil fuels. So the second strategy, engage with companies to raise standards. And we've had some talk about engagement, and it's hard to talk about engagement these days without the ExxonMobil story. You will probably know that a small hedge fund, Engine number one, which I think is a wonderful name for a hedge fund, took on the mighty Exxon, once the world's largest company, certainly not anymore, and organized essentially a coup. And managed to get the support of major investors, including BlackRock and Vanguard and others, in order to kick out 3 directors and replace them with more climate transition-minded directors. And this is a really interesting case because it's one of the first times where you've seen a flexing of the muscles on that scale by some of the big passive funds who own large amounts of stock, and also other institutional investors as well as passive funds. So we're likely to see more of these kind of actions by shareholders in order to call company management to account on climate change issues and more broadly on ESG issues. And this is coupled with a sort of really strong issue that actually it's in the duty of directors to manage climate risk. So ESG integration for funds and for anyone who has a fiduciary duty and a fiduciary responsibility isn't an issue of best practice. In most cases, these risks are financially material, and it's an obligation. And as is warned by Chapman Tripp in this excellent toolkit that they've prepared for directors, directors need to be aware of their duties. They need to be aware that the legal action for neglect of climate risk is on the rise. And one of the things that Daniel Kaldermis, one of the authors of this report, talks about is to fast forward in 10 years' time, and when you're standing in a courtroom and the judge turns around and says, well, did you know about this risk of climate change? It's now impossible to say no. And so are directors acting on this? Are trustees acting on it? And in a way, are asset owners and fund managers acting on climate risk? And one of the interesting things we did in this survey that again we saw the deep dive from, this is I think a really cool chart because it confirms everyone's prejudices. We get tremendous arguments from those who say it's better to not divest and it's better not to avoid things. It's better, in fact, to engage with companies versus others who are more wedded to divestment avoidance. This chart says, is it more important for an investment company to firstly avoid sectors you don't agree with? About a quarter says yes. Avoid the worst companies. More say avoid the worst companies in any sector and include more companies with higher standards. And then don't avoid any companies but engage with them to change their practices or not sure. So if we look at these, if you're somebody who says, well, actually you should avoid the worst companies, then what you see is there's a sum of these three segments here that say, yes, you should avoid. And the argument tends to be only, should you avoid a whole sector or should you just avoid the worst companies? But it's still an avoidance of harm. And those who are advocates of engagement say, oh, well, look, I mean, the engagement side of the equation is also large because you're including companies with higher standards and you're engaging with change practices. So essentially, this confirms both sides of an argument, which I believe is entirely a rather constructed argument, because I think practically what most funds do these days is a combination of all of the three strategies that we're talking about. They avoid things, they engage, and they invest in better companies. So investing for positive impact. So at a simple level, we can live in a world where money is used for what people want, for social housing, renewable energy, community development. And these are the kind of things that the public say in our annual survey that they want to invest in. No surprises here: renewable energy, healthcare, medical products, likely to be high at the moment, sustainable water, affordable housing, etc. So these are the kind of issues that people want to invest in. And the impact investment field in New Zealand is growing, as we've seen from previous presentations. I would give a plug for a series on mindful money. We're doing online seminars, 7:30 on Wednesday evenings. And the one tomorrow is around mainstream funds investing in social housing with community finance, which has put a number of deals together, Generate, KiwiSaver, community housing provider, and Shamabil Yaakov to set the stage in terms of analysis. So details are on our website for that. I'm now going to sort of do a slightly shameless plug for Mindful Money, because how to invest ethically, and Sebastian was nice enough to give me a lead into this. You can go and look at Mindful Money, because what Mindful Money does is we do absolutely painstaking research to decode all these portfolios so that you can look, for example, at all 321 KiwiSaver funds and see what's inside their portfolios in terms of the issues that New Zealanders care about. Similarly, with over 400 managed funds. These give an insight into the investment process from the perspective of an objective reality. What is it actually that funds invest in? And it gets away slightly from, do they tick a box for a PRI survey or for somebody else's survey? And actually, it looks at what the investment in a portfolio looks like. So without picking on ANZ, oh, sorry, this is, can you see this, Sebastian?
It's not opening up that well. And I do have to push you for time a little bit, if that's possible.
Okay, so let me just go back to the...
You could have time for some questions if you're interested.
Yep. I just wanted to finish off with one thing, just 1 second. So I hope you're seeing this now.
Yes.
Cool. So just as to say, Mindful Money shows where funds invest. This is ANZ Growth Fund, and shows the companies that they invest in, listed by the key issues that the New Zealand public are concerned about. I just want to finish with one issue. When we've talked about these investment strategies, they have their counterpart for climate action. And in a way, Lucas talked about some of this in his presentation, but funds can reduce emissions in their portfolio through portfolio construction, through active ownership, i.e. engagement, or through investing in climate solutions. And this gives rise to lower emissions in their portfolio. When we started looking at New Zealand funds, we found that actually very few New Zealand funds had signed up to net zero pledges, even while global pledges were on the track to $130 trillion as announced by Mark Carney at COP26. So the funds that have made pledges are Crown Financial Institutions, Superfund ACC, as we heard, and the Provident Fund and Government Superannuation Authority, plus BT Westpac, Mercer, Pathfinder, Russell, QB. So still relatively few funds. We did a survey of asset owners and fund managers, and very many of you on this call responded to the survey. So I just wanted to give a shout out and say thank you very much for doing so. But the survey was fascinating because it showed virtually every fund manager and virtually every asset owner was on a pathway to reduce their emissions, and almost all of them had a pathway to net zero in their future. So we can talk more about that in questions, but thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Barry. I had a quick question before I dive into these from the audience. I was wondering what data provider do you use to analyze the fund holdings in terms of not the holdings data, but the ESG data?
As per Florian's advice, we're rather promiscuous. So we like to use a number of different data providers for exactly the same reasons that he outlined. We find some unusual ESG scores. We don't typically use ESG scoring much because we find the process of aggregating the scoring often disguises what's important. So, for example, you can look at Exxon and say, yes, it does a very good job of cleaning up its water supply, but by the way, it spends hundreds of millions of dollars in convincing the Trump government not to do anything on climate change. So those things are ranked a little bit too equally for my liking.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. So we had an anonymous attendee ask, Barry, a lot of businesses and funds are well advanced with carbon footprinting and TCFD. I might argue otherwise, but anyway. But how will the natural capital issues and the upcoming TNFD and focus on harm to biodiversity be addressed by the industry? And can or will Mindful Money analyze this as well?
Yeah, really important point. So thankfully, the External Reporting Board, the XRB, has been given in their legislation a mandate not only to produce climate disclosure, but to use that as a basis to go on to produce broader measures of environment and social measures to include in reporting. And that should include biodiversity as one of those key measures. And so that becomes a window to getting a common metric for reporting on those issues across investment funds. In the real world context outside of investment, I'd certainly love to see a payment for biodiversity services, which was equivalent to a payment for carbon sequestration, because what we're seeing is a completely unbalanced land use equation because biodiversity services are not valued, whereas carbon sequestration is. So there's lots to do on biodiversity. I used to work for WWF in early days of my life, and it's an issue I'm very passionate about.
Agreed. Thank you, Barry. And we are going to have to move on